Taking the job of off-season caretaker for a hotel turns out to be a lot more than a man and his family bargained for. That's basically, of course, the story of The Shining. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Here's Danny, I guess.
And yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, yes, you said, yeah. Who'd have guessed that you're in the middle of winter in Colorado, looking after a hotel by yourself, and something bad might happen and you go mad and attack your family? I think we're all fairly familiar with The Shining as a story. And
this is like a continuation of our Stephen King discussion, but at the same time, it's also touching on, Stanley Kubrick, who I think we both admire. And so it's a whole discussion in itself. I think it's a statement as well that between this and Lolita, Kubrick's films haven't really been remade, as much as you think that, as much as we have talked about remakes all the time and stuff like that.
I know it actually restores your faith in humanity a little bit that people haven't tried to remake Stanley Kubrick's films too often. But yeah, I suppose Lolita is the only one. We guess we can do that one in a future episode. But
that's true.
Yeah. So yeah, we've got this, the 1980 original and the 1997 miniseries, which has kind of pretty much disappeared from most streaming services and other stuff. It took us quite a while to track it down, but quite an interesting watch nonetheless. But yeah. So The Shining, the original.
I think for me, it's one of those iconic films where different scenes, right, with, of course, Jack Nicholson tearing through the door, Shelley Duvall screaming in terror and stuff like that. And, kind of the little boy, Danny, kind of just the fright on his eyes, is captured, and we really feel it as the audience and stuff. So many iconic moments and everything. But ironically, this is a movie that at the time when it was released, was up for 2 Razzies. King himself actually gave it, his thumbs down.
Yeah, I mean, as we're sort of saying a little before the video, I think the pacing of this movie is really interesting, because it starts off quite slow and mundane in a way. It's very sort of down to earth. The person's just getting the job. There's a very kind of mundane kind of interview in a way. And you see this very isolated existence where people are getting bored, and there's long lingering shots on them. Specifically Jack just getting kind of bored and getting kind of frustrated with the isolation. And then the entire tempo kind of changes towards the end of the movie to the point where, as he becomes more and more maniacal, his acting obviously becomes bigger and bigger. And so I can kind of see that it has this kind of over-the-top quality that puts some people off. But I don't know, for me, that's kind of part of the appeal of the movie. I mean, most of it is fairly, and what's really sort of creepy and effective for me is that there is this kind of quite slow pacing to begin with, but it's really just punctuated by Danny's strange manifestation of Tony, and which apparently he improvised on his first take, the whole doing that, which is pretty amazing. And then these very kind of powerful still or very slow motion visual shots of these visions that he's having. And I think what's so sort of interesting about those is that it's their visual sort of power, but their lack of motion that gives them this kind of dreamlike quality, in that he's, there's just him riding around, and then there's just the 2 twins just perfectly static there in the middle of the screen, or the blood just kind of slowly engulfing the screen. Things like that give it a very kind of surreal element, I think, that makes you question, that what he's seeing is not real, but it's also done in such a way that really draws you into it, I think.
What fascinates me is how, we don't think of Kubrick as a horror director, yet whenever he steps into these different genres, right, sci-fi for 2001, or war for Full Metal Jacket and everything, he really kind of just I mean, he's full bore into it. Like he doesn't do anything halfway. And I think like one of the things I remember kind of coming across was his assistant talking about like kind of getting him copies of movies like The Exorcist, and like that he just watches for hours, and like he's really just studying it, I guess, for different things. And like he's not kind of just what's called just I'm gonna basically I'm gonna just do what everybody's done for like horror and stuff like that. He's kind of like really kind of looking at what is it that kind of what makes it tick, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could say that when you're watching movies, especially old classics, there will be certain scenes that always kind of jump out at you as particularly affecting. That can be in any movie, really. And I think what's brilliant about Kubrick is that he seems to take all of these different sort of elements of what was good about those scenes and, probably the entire film history, and manages to kind of pack those into every scene almost in his movies. Every scene is almost memorable in some respect.
Yes. So it's funny also, like, you were talking about that one scene where they did it on the first take and everything like that, where Kubrick has his reputation, right, for like, doing hundreds of takes and everything.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what sort of, doing a bit of reading about the behind the scenes. I mean, he was very, very careful and treated Danny, the actor who played Danny, really, really well, and shielded him from a lot of the actual sort of horror and the other elements of the movie. But put the rest of the actors through absolute bloody hell. It was just like he brought both Scatman Carruthers and Shelley Duvall to tears during the production.
Right.
And I mean, he takes that whole method style to the extreme. I mean, he told everyone on set to be nasty or unsympathetic to Shelley Duvall to get her into a kind of a hysterical state. He only fed Jack Nicholson cheese sandwiches, which he hates, to sort of get him into the requisite angry state to portray Jack on screen. And I mean, just some of the simplest scenes that you think should be relatively easy, just like Jack Nicholson bouncing the ball off the wall. They did that like 60 times or something like that. So it's I mean, he's a very obsessive filmmaker.
And I think what something else that like in the Warner Brothers documentary about his life kind of that hit me was this comment about how he never really wanted to worry about like, oh, I wish we had if we had more time we would have gotten that shot, whatever. And so he really designed his life to get to that point, like from like when after like the first few movies he started getting more and more control versus like Spartacus was a film where Kirk Douglas kind of like we talked about with Ben-Hur and stuff like that, where the actor had a producer credit, but also like good deal of control, stuff like that. So after that, the next film we did, I think it was 2001, and then like we're basically like he had control on that one, like that was him, like kind of basically soup to nuts, kind of like what happened with Lucas and everything like that. And I think it's no coincidence that like these folks, knew each other, kind of, because, as we talked about beforehand, there was Lucas wrapping up shooting for Empire Strikes Back and stuff like that. And meanwhile, kind of the shooting The Shining, like kind of on the Eltree, lot and stuff like that.
Yeah. And as if you don't know, they had 700,000 watts of light outside of each window in the Elstree studio to sort of recreate daylight on a snowy day. So they said the result was incredibly hot on set. But it just shows you the length they went to create the visual effect. But you wouldn't know that it was all done on a London studio. And that same space was used by Steven Spielberg in Raiders of the Lost Ark as well.
But that's that's the degree of obsessive control, and so we'll get into with the miniseries and stuff where like they kind of actually use the hotel that King modeled things after, but here Kubrick got his assistants to like a year in advance, whatever, for pre-production to go to different hotels to get shots, and where they ordered all the different pieces of furniture, all that kind of stuff, and then they reproduce, like you said, a hotel that doesn't really exist. Like they basically got ideas and then they kind of designed their own Overlook and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think what's one of the most sort of striking visual elements, which pretty much everyone can recognize because I used it as a background on my Microsoft Teams in business meetings, and that is just a view of the corridor with the very sort of geometric carpet design,
Right.
which is very, very distinctive. But I think it, I think there's a thematic kind of joining there between Danny and his dad, because you have Danny riding around these sort of geometric patterns, almost like a maze of corridors. And then at the end of the movie, you have Jack, walking around, a literal maze. So it's both of them trying to kind of, I often think mazes are representative of entrapment or psychological problems. We've seen that in Westworld as well. Like, the maze was how they learned the secret of their own kind of consciousness. Sorry, spoiler alerts if you've not watched all of Westworld there. But yeah, in this, I think it's the same. It's sort of Danny figuring out his powers and where they sort of sit in relation to the hotel and his relationship with his parents. And with Jack, it's actually getting lost within the maze and sort of losing himself within it.
Yeah, and I guess this is probably as good as time as any to touch on how in Room 237, which is a documentary that kind of talks about all these kind of crazy theories that people have about the movie and stuff. I think to me, like what I take out of it, rather than like kind of getting into each different theory and stuff like that, is that Kubrick, like because he puts so much detail into things that it's so open to interpretation. It's so like, because also, unlike, again, the miniseries where we'll get it to that, like they're very literal about things. Kubrick loves to have that kind of dream effect that you talk about. And then meanwhile, leave it very open to interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also the way the ghosts, quote unquote, are represented in it. Is very very a modern sort of take, and a very very clever take on ghosts, in that they are represented realistically. So you have, rather than it being a case of, oh, that's a scary ghost, it's this thing of, it's more a question of the sanity of Jack, and they look real to him and they look real to you as the viewer. So you're kind of sucked into his head, and you're also questioning, if you're not paying attention, are these just other people, or are these, just figments of his imagination, which I think is a much more effective way of doing, characters that aren't, that are ghosts or are visions and things like this. So.
Yeah, I think what's funny for me is that, the Shining in some ways, you can like take it as that, like, it's all a dream, and like that like there is really nothing supernatural and stuff. In fact, that's like kind of the Wendy theory and stuff, is that like she's apparently, according to that theory, the one that's going insane, and this is all stuff going through her head, and certainly Shelley Duvall gives the part of the appearance. I mean, granted, Jack is like kind of looks like he's kind of going off the deep end, but she looks even more like she's really become unhinged.
Oh, totally, yeah. And I know, as we'll probably get into, Stephen King was not really happy with the way the Kubrick original turned out, because he felt that she was a bit too much of a sort of a hysterical, doting mother kind of victim character, and not quite as strong as Wendy's portrayed in the novel. And I think what's kind of what you get from actually the miniseries and probably the novel is there is a lot of the exploring the fringes of sanity in a relationship is much more what the novel's about, in that the struggles with the alcoholism, and that how that plays into their relationship, and their lack and breakdown of trust as a relationship is much more what the story is about, I think, in the novel, than just someone going a bit loopy and chasing someone around with an axe. So I can kind of see why he had that criticism of the original.
And what's funny also is that the alcoholism is supposed to be like almost front and center for the basic story and stuff, but I'd say that like Kubrick didn't really want to do that actually for some reason.
No.
Like he kind of almost pulled back on that one. And you know, again, we'll get into that with the miniseries, that's much more of the story and stuff. But funny enough, we won't really talk about it as much, but you know, for Doctor Sleep, it again kind of comes to the forefront, even though that like they actually in the you know, this being the sequel to The Shining, they actually base their the movie anyways, base things more on, you know, Kubrick's version. So like kind of there's this Kubrick version of the story and versus like kind of, you know, King's and stuff, and it's kind of a, you know, so Doctor Sleep is a weird, you know, hybrid of you know, kind of taking from the original source material versus, you know, Kubrick's version.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think sort of, you know, the way Kubrick portrays Jack is really interesting for me, because he seems in that he seems slightly unhinged and distant and slightly threatening to his family pretty much from the offset.
Yeah.
It just starts off very subtle and becomes more and more prominent as the movie goes on.
Definitely.
And it always sort of reminds me of that that phrase about sort of men and their role in relationships and earning a living, which is, you know, a lot of men live a life of quiet desperation, and you get this kind of feeling that is where Jack is at the beginning, and the isolation kind of makes that desperation into kind of, you know, a real horrendous situation by the end of it. So it's kind of weird because it's, you know, I'm sure a lot of men have this feeling of, you know, you have to provide and you have to sort of focus on your legacy and making your mark on the world, but you also have to sacrifice a lot of your time and energy to your family as well. So there's this constant kind of thing of like, which do you really sort of explore? And you know, with Jack's character, you see this kind of this obsessive kind of preoccupation with making your mark on the world going completely awry, and that this, you know, this play that he's been writing is nothing but the same phrase repeated over and over, and that it's a complete sort of breakdown of sanity, and it's almost like he's just sort of submitted to the pressures of what you're supposed to do, and just use violence as an escape from that, more or less, in a way. Or, you know, you get the feeling that he's kind of trapped in his situation and trapped in the hotel at the same time.
And we kind of touched a little bit about kind of the weird coincidences with the Amityville horror and stuff. And
yes.
you know,
One of my favorite pet theories. We'll add our own little pet. So just to list these off for people, because I did make a note of this. Amityville, which came out a few years earlier, you know, it has a father going mad with an axe. It has a red room, not a red rum. It's built on an ancient burial ground, much like the Overlook Hotel.
Right.
The girl in Amityville has an imaginary friend that she talks to, and the rest of the parents think she's slightly unhinged because of this. It also has, rather than blood coming down out of an elevator, it has blood dripping downstairs. And there is also a spooky old woman that kind of appears before the father and tries to sort of attack him. So quite a few similarities, really.
And for me, like the biggest one is, you know, like besides the India burial ground, is just, you know, like kind of the place as a source of evil. I mean, you know, like even the one line too, you know, where Dick Hollaran says, you know, by the way, played by Scatman Crothers, you know, that places are like people, some shine and some don't. And and it's also like kind of echoes a little bit of what we talked about with The Grudge, you know, like kind of like there's sometimes these dark places, these places that really just kind of seem to emanate the kind of certain evil and stuff.
Yeah, like a spiritual connection of the location is, it's you know, it's basically the, you know, the haunted house trope, really. I think that's what it is. And nearly all haunted house movies have something where something horrible happened at one stage or another. So
I think the some of the theories around, you know, kind of Indians and kind of the connection about that symbolizing, you know, how history tends to have, you know, we have this cycle of violence and stuff like that. I think there's a lot to that because of the fact that, like, beyond like kind of, you know, apparently the shots of like Kubrick, you know, when he was like intentionally putting the Calumet Indian headed baking, powder on the shells and stuff, to, like when you look at like kind of the different walls with the tapestry and stuff like that, and the pictures of Indians and everything like that. I mean, I think a lot of that is very, very literal and very intentional stuff. And so I think, definitely, like, I think there is an idea of that we do have, like these the almost like karma, if you will, of like, hey, you killed like kind of all these different Indians, like, you had this burial ground and stuff, right? And then, meanwhile, like kind of, this white family moves in and kind of, so
Yeah.
I think another kind of funny kind of, coincidence that, like, to me, it's got to be more than coincidence. It's that like different times there's a very intentional wearing of red, white, and blue, like, like throughout the whole thing.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose Jack Nicholson wears kind of like a lumberjack shirt through most of the movie, doesn't he? It's a very kind of, I guess country American kind of look he goes for in that. But yeah, I think as well, one of the interesting things that obviously Stephen King didn't like about it, but I think is really clever, is the way he takes themes from the original and reinvents them visually. I mean, I think that's what's really the clever thing about Kubrick, is that his ability to take a narrative point and compress it into one very powerful kind of visual image. Like in the original story, you've got this fire hose that kind of tries to sort of attack Danny, and then there's sort of blood that comes out of the fire hose. Now, he obviously thought having a sort of a fire hose on a stick would probably look pretty silly, and he was right, probably. But he's reinvent, this idea of like, gushing blood is obviously where the whole elevator opening with the blood coming out is. He just very cleverly made that a much more powerful kind of symbol, but the same kind of visual effect. Likewise, the topiary animals is not a particularly frightening thing, but but the hedge, the maze is an equally frightening but much more realistic interpretation of that idea of having plant life that's kind of threatening, and you can't sort of, you're questioning your own place and space, which I guess was the kind of idea that was implied by the topiary kind of like moving and then not moving when you look at them and things like this. So
well, also like when you said that, reminds me of like a certain moment where he's looking at a model of the maze and stuff, and then next thing you know, we're actually, as an audience, we're seeing the maze, and Wendy and Jack are kind of, or excuse me, Danny are walking through it. So like this kind of like change the perspective, like kind of makes it, like kind of where different times we're kind of questioning, again, what are we looking at and stuff? Are we looking at this kind of, model and kind of, or are we looking at the actual, maze stuff, which we end up, like kind of, in other words, it was a quick shift, like kind of that Jack's looking at the model. Next thing you know, we're actually in the maze with Wendy and Danny and stuff.
Yeah. It's very clever kind of visual trick, that. And more trivia, apparently all the snow was nothing but salt and styrofoam in vast quantities, because it was obviously very, very warm, but from all the lights, no less. But there's lots of sort of times where you have almost like a diagrammatic sort of view of the scene, and then the scene actually sort of becomes a moving place with characters in it, so to speak. I mean, you can sort of see the rugs, the Indian rugs on the wall kind of mirror a lot of the sort of geometric stuff in the rest of the movie. So and of course, I guess, sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, another part that was striking is how a lot of the things that happen, that seem supernatural, we never see that, whereas like in maybe like a typical kind of horror movie or haunted, kind of house movie or whatever, people are kind of like just seeing it all together. But one of the things that's kind of really striking is that like you never see any of that happen except for when the people are isolated. So like there's this kind of sense that like, again, is it really happening, or is it happening from the perspective of Danny or Wendy or, Jack and stuff?
Yeah. I think as well, it's when you actually think about it, it's really not a very gory movie.
Mm.
I mean, there's literally only one real killing in it,
Yeah.
which is Scatman Carruthers.
Right.
I don't know that, unless there's kind of like a flashback maybe of someone else who gets killed in the hotel.
Yeah, there's like one of the I guess it's a guest or whatever, like kind of has this kind of cut through his head and stuff like that. And then we do see the little girls kind of, you know, that like they're you know, base dismembered or whatever, stuff like that. But like it's just them lying in a pool of blood. It's not, it's kind of, and that's the other thing that's kind of interesting is a lot of the shots, rather than being kind of the close-ups and stuff, it's all pretty much kept at a certain perspective. So it's like, again, you know, like kind of, are we seeing like kind of the things, or is it like kind of just, you know, like how sometimes we when we have like this, you know, again, that dreamlike quality and stuff, it always seems like kind of at a distance, almost like just out of reach and stuff.
Almost like kind of a filming of an auto, you know, not like a crime scene, rather than an actual violent killing, which is what you'd obviously see in your regular slasher movies and stuff. Because I mean, Halloran being killed is really the only real live violent killing in it. Everything else is a series of images really that are just flashed before you. So
it's semi close up, but even then it's still at a certain distance though.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's credit to how creepy the movie is, that actually there isn't really very much of that.
No.
It's very, but it has that kind of, you know, like most of his movies, has a kind of a slightly distanced, abstract kind of quality to what's going on about it. So,
and the thing that mentioned there is that, like, I think one of the kind of technological, you know, innovations that was perfectly timed for him was the Steadicam. Like, in other words, that was like new technology at the time, but you know, Kubrick heard about it and he's like, oh, you know, let's see how we can use that. And so a lot of these hallway shots of like kind of following Danny and all that kind of stuff that, like, you know, has that feel that like of fluidity and like kind of, you know, again, but meanwhile keeping a certain distance and everything, is because the fact that, like, you know, this is something that just was available on the market now and stuff. And so in fact, he hired the inventor to, you know, do the shots and stuff too. So, you know, Kubrick definitely, like, he was like, you know, just kind of like Disney stuff is, you know, more than happy to embrace like kind of the latest and greatest. And Lucas, who, like, you know, we've talked about some different times as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the phrase fluidity of the shots, because there is a very kind of like, fluid motion to a lot of the moving shots. And I just think of that opening shot where there's the, you know, it's got that, you know, that was probably quite groundbreaking at the time, especially as you can't hear the obvious helicopter in the background. It just has the music and it's sort of gliding over. And likewise with like you said, with the tricycle shots and things like that, they're all very, very effective and have this kind of very slow, kind of meandering, fluid sensation to them. Yeah.
And speaking of music, we've got to kind of touch on that now. Like, kind of that's another kind of trademark Kubrick thing. Like, you know, whether it's 2001 or any of these other movies, that like, you know, he definitely had a thing for music. Like, you know, because even in the kind of more quiet scenes where, you know, like kind of where with seeing the bar and the kind of all the guests and everything like that, you hear the kind of 20s music and stuff. It's definitely you know, Kubrick kind of paying attention to, like, you know, what would kind of really give more of the feel of the kind of the time, or like kind of the moment and stuff.
Yeah, this kind of abstract classical synth work in the beginning is really something else. I mean, you know, I also just in Clockwork Orange, there's some really powerful synths is all I can really describe them as. It's but obviously it's just, you know, very, very memorable piece of music. So yeah, I mean, obviously we could reel off lots and lots of trivia about The Shining and whether the sets were mirrored or whether they were intentional and all this kind of thing. But I mean, I think, are there any other sort of main themes that you think? I mean, I think we covered this kind of role of parents going mad, isolation, you know, paranoia, this kind of thing.
I just have one question for you though. Like, you know, so, and again, as always, major spoilers, stuff like that. So that final shot of Jack, from 1921, what's your interpretation of it?
Well, I mean, this is the whole thing, is that he's been sort of possessed by this idea that he must be the caretaker. It's kind of funny. It was quite groundbreaking, I think, at the time, but now it's kind of seems to be in every other movie almost. It's like, I mean, it was effective when I probably first watched it in the early 80s, and it's done in such a way that it's quite haunting in a way, because it doesn't sort of bring a load of attention to it. It's not like a dun 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 or something. Right, it's just kind of drifts into it and you see him and then it ends. It's I think it's kind of it's effective enough. Well, what's your interpretation of it? I haven't watched Doctor Sleep, which you have, so maybe you've got a different take on it.
There wasn't really anything per se that was like literally in Doctor Sleep about it, but for me, it's one of the few supernatural elements to it, because the basic question to me is, that's the thing. It's actually is the question. It's like, why is he in the photo? So for me, that's really what's effective about it, is the question that it creates. Kind of, why is he, like, in other words, it's not Kubrick telling us like kind of, oh, it's all a dream, or, oh, kind of none of this really happened, or anything like that. It's him like kind of opening up the question box of like, what is this guy doing in this photo from the 20s and stuff, that this guy that we've been watching throughout this movie. And I think that's really what it really is just simply like that he wanted us to like kind of, question, like what was it all really about? What really kind of happened and stuff. And I kind of treat it as like that's a supernatural element of, or like that's a kind of like really what makes this a supernatural kind of movie and stuff, because everything else was like kind of can be more literal and more kind of like, in your, like you're seeing it stuff, or you're kind of seeing, a dream sequence or from the perspective or anything like that. But, and you're wondering for the most part, was it all like kind of, in somebody's head and stuff. But then I think that was like kind of like on horror movies where different times, there's like that kind of, like the typical horror movie is like, Freddy's still alive or something like that. And right. So that's typical thing. But I think Kubrick's version is that like, okay, kind of, that's the reveals that like, this was kind of something more than like kind of, a dream thing and stuff.
Yeah. It's a very interesting sort of thing to throw in there, and being copied so many times afterwards. But speaking of being copied so many times, I guess it's probably time to move on to the 1997 remake, a miniseries starring Steven Weber and Rebecca DeMornay of Risky Business fame.
Yes, definitely.
And I can't remember the name of the kid.
Courtland Mead.
There we go, Courtland Mead. Yeah. So, not an easy task to undertake by any stretch of the imagination, remaking a cinema classic, but, off they go.
So certainly Stephen King had motivation to do it, because he wanted his version of it. And in fact, this one has the approved stamp of approval, I guess, and stuff. But the question that we always go back to is like, why remake what's become an iconic movie?
I mean, for him, it's obviously he felt there was, and I think it's the struggle between the parents, the relationship, and that bit of lack of trust and breakdown of a kind of a family unit that he really wanted to capture, that wasn't really so much in the original. So that was obviously the story he wanted to get across. Unfortunately, I think it fails on lots of other, but it doesn't really fail, so to speak. It's just much weaker in many other respects. So
well, like you already said, many of us have watched The Shining different times and stuff, and it's so memorable and everything. But this version, like before we get into all the details and stuff, it's got a pretty much a more literal translation of King's novel stuff, but yet it just doesn't. It's just not as memorable.
No, I mean it's really because it's trying to sort of literally retelling a book is not always as effective as visually reinventing it, which is clearly what Stanley Kubrick's the master at. I mean, there's a few things that when written down may seem scary, but topiary that kind of looks like it's moving towards you just isn't really that scary. Likewise, a fire hose that falls off the wall at you and then sort of spouts a little bit of blood is also not particularly frightening. And I mean, also when floating Tony, because in the original Tony, again, because Kubrick wanted to make us sort of question whether this was Danny's imagination or not. In this, we actually get to see Tony, and unfortunately, through some weird decision, he's floating in the first few scenes. He's kind of just floating 3 feet above the ground. It's one of those things, I guess, because it's made for TV, they want to sort of say, hey, everyone, between the advert breaks, that's definitely a ghost right there. It's not a real person. So, yeah, we have this sort of preppy teenager, Tony, who kind of turns up, and that may well be literal to the book, but it's, obviously far less effective than a little kid creepily putting on a fake voice and waggling his finger.
And I think that one of the things that really drags it out is, the whole planes, trains, and automobiles journey of Dick, like, from Florida to back to the hotel. Whereas in the original movie, he's just coming from like Denver or somewhere like kind of fairly nearby. So it's definitely a lot more effective than trying to it's kind of like I don't know. I'm trying to think of something else that's like that, but it's almost like kind of like those cartoons where like Bugs Bunny like kind of jumping on a plane to, taking like a bus and like, it just kind of has that kind of feel.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And on a book, it's supposed to sort of demonstrate the extent of Danny's power and his ability to communicate this, But here, as you said, it just seems like, someone got left behind and they're just, like you said, it's a bit cartoon-like, and it's just, meanwhile in Florida, and then meanwhile at the airport, and meanwhile at this, and eventually he gets there. I need to be knocked over the head with a croquet mallet, but
right after all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's in the original, it's kind of silly as well because he does just kind of turn up to get killed. At least this one he makes it,
but he also at least serves the purpose of providing like a way out though for Wendy and Danny though. So I mean, that's kind of like, okay, and what's interesting also is that like in the original, as much as like, Jack seems violent and all that, he actually doesn't really, other than killing Scatman Crothers, and axing the door, he doesn't actually harm, Wendy or Danny and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily because of him, but it's more like kind of this bubble of safety, I guess, and stuff like that, versus, in this one, I mean, he's like going to town, like kind of, basically throwing, Danny, hitting, Wendy, like with the, the mallet and stuff.
Yeah, it's a much more on your nose kind of comment on, I guess, abusive relationships and alcoholism in this. And clearly it's, it's laid out for you that the more he drinks, the more he ends up sort of hitting them and being abusive, both sort of verbally and physically. So it was obviously the point that Stephen King felt was missing, and because we have about an hour and a half of it in this, so I mean, it's I mean, I guess as well in this one, it's more of a 90s movie in that Wendy's a much stronger kind of character in this. She takes a lot more beating and kind of fights back quite a lot more. And she's also much more quick to question his decisions and motives. And he also sort of there's this added thing of like, he sort of accuses her of almost emasculating him to some degree, which isn't really in the original at all.
Right.
So.
But meanwhile, there's the MTV effect where, Rebecca De Mornay, like, is definitely a far cry from Shelley Duvall.
Yeah. But I mean, that's what King wanted. He describes her as a blonde kind of cheerleader type who wouldn't have to deal with something like this. And I thought Rebecca De Mornay did a good job in this, actually. And I thought, all things considered, the kid did a good job as well. But I mean, it's when working with children, you want to focus on the visual elements and less on relying on them delivering lots and lots of exposition, because it's never, you're asking a lot, as we've learned from Children of the Corn. But Steven Weber, I mean, they're big boots to fill that you've got to try and do not only a remake of Jack Nicholson's performance, but you've got to do 5 hours of it as well, which is tough. And I felt actually he was actually very good, I thought, as the father who's slowly losing his grip. I think it was when he starts being the drunk, and then towards the end he's really sort of going a bit over the top, and it was hard to kind of like create much tension with his performance, because he just seems to be constantly shouting and going angry towards the end of the, and it gets a bit OTT.
I mean, there's no doubt, like, these actors did a good job with what they had, stuff like that. But I mean, I think it goes back to, though, that like when you have a script that's so literal to a story that's kind of designed for like kind of I mean, the novel is what it is, but like just like you said, you can't necessarily just translate things to the screen and expect kind of it to be effective, because overall, like besides like kind of the fire hose, the temporary animals and stuff, it just has a much besides having the typical television made for television feel and stuff like that, it just also like kind of it's just not as scary as like when we talk about Salem's Lot, actually. Salem's Lot, there were things that were effective, even though that like it was dated and like kind of it was what it is for the time and stuff. But I think even that like kind of was I think they made changes like kind of for realizing that that's going to be a television movie and stuff like that, that they kind of made the changes to kind of adjust and everything. But here in this series, they really just kind of just tried to do a more literal translation, and it just kind of it wasn't like with the eye of like will this work visually and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think for me as well, the ghosts are pretty ineffective in this as well, in that they've just made up all of the ghosts with some white makeup and it just kind of so obviously, rather than a few sort of glimpses of someone who looks completely realistic, we've now got like quite a lot of dialogue for ghosts with white faces all the way through, and it's kind of, and then there's green light behind them to make them obviously a bit spookier. So it's kind of not as effective really.
Ironically, though, when we talk about the original being up for Razzies and stuff, here the series won like Primetime Emmy Awards and Saturn Awards. So go figure.
I mean, it's I would for all its shortcomings, it's quite tense actually. It's pretty good. I mean, it's certainly by far not the worst of the remakes we've watched by any stretch.
No, definitely.
So, and it does a good job of creating tension and things like this. But there's only so many times an inanimate object can move or a door can slam, and there's a bit of kind of doom-like music in the background to make you think, oh, there's something else going on here. They use that quite a lot. I mean, thankfully they didn't go too over the top, I suppose. But it just wasn't very inventive really in the way of it creating tension in the movie, in my opinion.
But just so funny to me that like, I mean, given the awards and stuff like that like the one that was like kind of was originally rebuked and stuff is the one that's going to stand the test of time. We're going to not only rewatch it, but it's so memorable. And here the series like that won so many awards and stuff, but in the end, like who's going to watch it other than somebody else who's like interested, like, hey, wasn't there a remake? And
I know, right? I mean, only people like us, and you'd really have to search hard for it as well. It wasn't easy to find it, so it just shows you. But yeah, I mean, hey, Showgirls, that's all I got to say. Classic that will one day reach the lofty heights that it deserves.
Another funny kind of difference though too is that like in this one we have the massive explosion, like kind of so this ending in fire that like that King actually for whatever reason like for him that's the ending of The Shining and stuff like that that's meant to be. But meanwhile in the original it's Jack freezing, it's kind of like it's ice versus cold and stuff like that.
Yeah, well for me, I think it's in a way, I think it's more about this kind of entrapment and the maze sort of element and the characters figuring their way out. Like Danny, it's kind of trying to figure his way out of things, and for Jack, he's lost basically, and that's pretty much where they end it. And Frozen also, I guess there's an element of being sort of frozen in time.
I was gonna say,
in terms
yeah,
of, yeah, you know, and being
with the
frozen
photo
with,
and stuff.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you know, here's another question for you then. Like, so what for you is like a more hopeful ending? Because like in theory, the series, you know, we see like kind of Danny graduating, kind of it's, you know, kind of supposed to be more hopeful and everything like that. But yet, I don't know, like
Oh well, yeah. I mean, obviously the TV one has a much more sort of comfy TV ending, really, with most of them surviving. And the dad, interestingly, the different sort of perspective on Jack's character is that, of course, in the TV show, he sacrifices himself. He overpowers the spirit that's kind of possessing him and destroys the hotel purposefully. Whereas, you know, in Kubrick's movie, Jack is the victim of his own anger and his own destructive influences, really. So that's yeah, noticeable difference, I guess. But yeah, definitely the TV's a more hopeful ending, in my opinion. Although there's not really any guarantee that Wendy and Danny made it out alive in the original movie. You know, they are still stuck in the middle of nowhere in, you know, the middle of a winter.
I mean, yeah, that's true. And but yet, here's the thing, though. I think it's hope for that. I think that's where it's hopeful that like that we hope things work out for them. Like I feel like kind of, you know, that like, you know, because things play out in the series, it's like kind of like, okay, you know, kind of, you know, happy ending, you know, that kind of thing, stuff like that. But I feel more, maybe like more, not necessarily hopeful, but then the desire for more hope for the fact that like, you know, they're going in almost like to an unknown fate and everything like that. And this, what's it called? I don't even know what it's called. The device, the snowmobile, I guess, or.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting ending in the original as well. I mean, I still kind of play. You know, you always expect some sort of big finale where in a horror movie where you know the bad guy gets killed or there's an explosion or something like this, and this is just, you know, someone frozen in a maze. It's really yeah, again, another very powerful sort of image and an interesting theme of you know, of a place completely enveloping someone. You know, yeah. So aside from that, I mean, any other? I mean, we've got the weird white makeup, you know, the animal masks and things like this. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty good, I suppose, all things considered. I can't really think of a huge amount more that's really worth going into with the remake.
I think, you know, we kind of, I guess I've probably been pretty what's called unforgiving of it and stuff like that. I think mostly because, you know, we had to sit through, you know, 4.5 hours, 6 hours with commercials and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm a little bit like kind of less forgiving in this case. And although it's not as bad as your criteria for bad remake, that like I can't say, yeah, I mean, I can't say that like I'm distressed or like kind of that it pained me to watch it. It had its moments and stuff. It just kind of this long, like, you know, it just really like, even though it's, in fact, if anything, because it was trying to stay so faithful to the novel and stuff like that, it had to drag it out to like tell, you know, because it had, you know, stuff that like, you know, the original just skipped over, like, like the whole thing of like Jack's job as a teacher with the debate club and this guy that kind of, you know, like, stuff that like we don't even see in the original and stuff, but then they had to include it in this miniseries because of the fact that like they wanted to kind of really pack in as much from the book as possible and stuff. But I think the main thing is that like, you know, does it really kind of tell the story that like of what we want to, you know, or do we need for The Shining and stuff like that? And you know, I think what's for me funny is that like I wouldn't treat, you know, Kubrick's version as like a Reader's Digest. It's dense in itself.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You know, because it's 2.5 hours. I mean, it's not a short, you know, it's not the typical hour and a half horror movie and stuff by any means either.
No, and just it, as I say, it just makes all the points much more powerfully, in my opinion. Yeah. So I guess, is this now the final of our Stephen King?
Well, I think we're gonna like, yeah, just step back from now because some of the other ones are much longer watches and everything. I think, you know, to celebrate the upcoming Godzilla versus King Kong movie. We'll look at those, and particularly the Godzilla, what's called different versions that have been made and everything like that. Although I think one thing that we kind of touched on a little bit that I thought about is maybe next up we'll cover like the others Kubrick movie Lolita that's been remade and stuff like that. So other than that, I think we'll probably put a pause button for Stephen King works, but then we'll come back to it when we get to look at some of these longer watches like Dead Zone and The Stand and stuff.
Yeah, well, if regular watchers may recall, we did a month of apes last year. So maybe we'll do a month of Godzilla this year or something like this, or a reptile month. Who knows? Maybe we can throw in
Kaiju marathon.
Yeah, Kaiju marathon, something like that. I did think of one other thing I just wanted to point out, and that's, of course, the most sort of iconic scene of Jack Nicholson bursting through the bathroom door. Here's Johnny, which, of course, I didn't understand being from England when I first watched it. But and neither did Stanley Kubrick. But, of course, how do you deal with that scene in the 1997 remake? He sticks his head through and goes, boo, which was just... It was,
Yeah, that says it all for like a typical kind of flaw of remakes. Kind of trying to do something different just to do it differently, and it lands flat.
There we go. That's my final word on it. So there you go.
Alrighty. So once again, thanks for watching. I'm John Chang, and we will catch you next time.